on the massing and placement of those buildings. And it provides that if the third story is granted, the building shall be no taller than 35 feet. And that is the height of the V Marketplace peak roof, so it shouldn't be taller than that building. And the development must use techniques to mitigate heavy or bulky forms, building placement that doesn't obscure view corridors, and building design that is compatible with adjacent structures. And the reason that's so important is that the V Marketplace building is a historically designated structure on the National Register of Historic Places, so we'll want to keep that in mind too. It further elaborates that buildings shall be stepped back, they shall be located toward the center of the development, and they shall avoid flat vertical planes or three-story development on Washington Street. And these rules make three-story infill development probably more feasible on the south lot than the north lot due to the fact that it's tucked away and can inherently meet some of these standards. But the 35-foot height limit itself makes three-story development somewhat challenging because of the preference for high ceilings and high plate heights. So we might find that developers opt for a two-story max in any case. But we will want to try to start defining these design characteristics tonight. We're also going to be looking at the Wine Train property. And we know that the Napa Valley Wine Train is seeking approval to build a hotel at the station down in Napa. We know that they're taking other steps to activate their line, and they represent a development opportunity here in Yountville that we should discuss now as part of this update. And again, the general plan policy for limited three-story building segments would apply to this property as well. It is a difficult parcel because it's so narrow at 30 or 40 feet in width at some parts, which can be challenging both in terms of setback and in FAR. But what's interesting about this parcel is that it has different visibility from the main part of town. Views from town proper are mitigated for the most part due to existing structures and landscaping. Northbound views on the highway are mostly shielded because of the California Drive overpass, and the most significant view comes from southbound traffic of that very narrow section of the building. And so we want to better understand these characteristics and start defining design guidelines for the property in general. The final property are the two vacant parcels on Humboldt, and this property would be rezoned from Old Town Historic, a residential designation, to residential scaled commercial, which is a commercial zoning designation. And that land use is really intended to affect a transition between commercial and residential uses, and for that reason, smaller pedestrian-style buildings are encouraged. Again, FAR, setbacks, height, all of that stuff is already defined by the zoning ordinance, but we'll have a chance to look at site design and orientation in order to better site everything to work on that property. So that's a real brief overview of what those parcels allow, the general plan policies that we're looking at. And now to get into the details, I'll hand it over to Rick Williams and John Doyle. Yes.
Does anybody have any questions? Are we going so far?
And then I think we will come join you now too if there are spare spaces in there.
I do have a question.
Yes.
Yeah.
So, are we live? We're live, all right. I'll just use that. Okay, great. My question, I guess, is if we could, if it's possible to clarify what a successful outcome from today's session would be. Like, how will we know when we're done with this session?
Well, I think you want to provide as much constructive feedback based on the very limited drawings you have in front of you. We're only looking at site plans, so we can only take this discussion so far. But you can start to visualize the types of buildings, their placement. Tonight we'll really focus on site orientation and layout. Details would allow us to go do some 3D renderings and come back before you.
Okay, so the idea is after we provide as much feedback as we can based on what we see and what we hear, so that when renderings are produced, they have the benefit of this conversation as input. Okay.
Yes.
All right. And we may want to have a separate maybe sidebar on the role and nature of renderings, because we know that they both help in some regard, but then can also
Yes,
stir
indeed.
discussion. So,
Yes, we do.
so we can sidebar that, but maybe towards the end we can talk about how they're used. Okay.
Okay, I have a question. We have the guidelines from the general plan, and we have the design ordinances. And they're pretty specific, as you just recapped them all, on three-story and massing and those things. So, has it ever been approached this way from the back direction before on empty properties, where we're deciding what we want it to look like before the property owners decide what they want it to look like?
Yes, and the reason is design guidelines are created by staff and the decision makers, and they set forth the vision for a property. I do think that property owner input can be useful in understanding how they want to use their property and how that might positively shape the architectural and design standards that we're drafting. But it's a mutual shared process where all viewpoints are considered, and the guidelines are developed based on what is considered the best guidelines for Yountville.
Okay, have the property owners had any input to this point?
We have not released any drawings, no.
But were
So
they part of discussions before this point, to this point,
we've been in discussion with all three of the property owners, yes,
about what they wanted to see? Or,
about what their interest is in the drawings, and so we're aware of their input, and now it's time for the town to discuss it in terms of decision maker input.
have they already had a say of what they want to see on the property? What
They
they're
haven't.
planning to
No.
build on the property?
No, they're here tonight, and it's a chance to start that discussion with everyone present, yeah. And Bob Brown, who is on our consultant team, is going to share information as well.
Just one more thought. When we talk about, where are we going with the process and how it will evolve, I think ultimately we would like to have design guidelines that are really just text and not have drawings that are associated with them. And that's because there's an infinite number of ways to lay out these properties. And to try to pick one and say this is, the ideal is not really what we want. But what we want to elicit from you is, things that you would like to see on the properties in terms of design aspects, things that you would absolutely not like to see, and we will then try to craft those, again, using these drawings as a means of eliciting feedback. And then we will ultimately try to draft these in a non-graphic way that tries to describe what the outcome is, what you would like to see. And again, we want it to be broad enough that there is discretion involved, that it's not absolutely defined, to the nth degree. So again, this is going to be an evolutionary process, but your feedback will guide it as we go along.
So what we develop will be part of the general plan then?
No,
Like design guidelines?
the zoning and design ordinance. So if you recall, the general plan is, the higher level policy document. We now have to incorporate those policies into the zoning and design ordinance, which is the implementing document.
Right.
And that's where, as of now, those are not consistent with the general plan. And this effort will bring all those volumes.
So we do want to keep it fairly unspecific, though. Because it may not get built for 20 years, and it may be a completely different world in 20 years.
Or at least very broad.
Yeah.
Yes, yes.
Okay. Okay.
Okay. Okay, so we're going to run through a very brief presentation. We're pretty familiar with Yountville. We've done some walks. I've lived in the general Marin-Sonoma Napa area for 60 years, so have seen it grow up over time. And we are excited because there's a lot of interesting characteristics that are kind of unique to Yountville, but we also want to illustrate some thinking about your community in a way similar to we've had conversations in other communities in a similar way. So we have some impressions, and can use those as part of the conversation, as well as looking at an additional similar community as we get into the kind of design, site evaluations, design concepts. And in the discussion over renderings, I don't think we'll ever have presentation renderings of what a building is going to look like. There'll be illustrative sketches to try to evoke your commentaries so that, because oftentimes a picture can say 1,000 words and you'll be able to elicit, say, whether or not that's what you meant or that's not what you meant. So we'll think of it that way. We're trying to give you something to react to so that you can better articulate your ideas and your vision of what is appropriate and not for your community. In walking through town on a number of occasions, one of the things that's really special about each of the individual developments is that they all seem to create really nice mid-block kind of paseos and courtyards, places for seating, internal to the sites as well as along the streets. They have simple forms and characteristics, but there are places that are more private and more public gathering spaces that are pretty unique. And it's really a place of meandering and discovery. And you can wander on the street or in the between the buildings, and that's a unique characteristic. There are only, to be honest, there are only a few towns in California that kind of have some of that characteristic, a few in really the West Coast. So you have a very special place that we think maintaining that unique characteristic is something that is important for you. Those are some of the fundamental principles of site planning that we see, which, after having thought about it a little bit, was very similar to one other community that, besides maybe a Carmel, in Winslow, in Bainbridge Island, if some of you have been there before, we worked on the downtown plan there, and we came up with this idea that there's discovery, there's an informality, you find unexpected places and encounters, which were really unique to that community. We coined a term that the community actually fell in love with, the Bainbridge Block, which was a compilation of buildings, some attached, some detached, some taller, some smaller, that created spaces that were interior, exterior spaces, and you could meander and wander through them. And so through both local architects and ourselves came up with this idea that you had a building block within which your community had a conversation about how to make places within the community. These are some of those spaces, small courtyards. Some of these are 2-story buildings, some 3-story buildings, ground floor retail, places you walk through to get to interior courtyards that you could always see through. They're very porous places where you could walk and wander, and they were very inviting, and then you found something exciting when you walked through to the other end. And even the streets, while there's an informality about them, they always attracted you to the next place on the other side of the street or the next plaza along the way. Some are very well appointed, and others are very informal and very unique in their own identity. Housing is something that is also very unique. We brought in a couple of illustrations here. We'll be looking at a variety of sites over this process. This is a community called Grow in Bainbridge Island, which has single-family homes, townhouses, apartments, all built around the idea of an agricultural residential community with courtyards. You can meander through them. They aren't all private spaces. They're public and private spaces. And it's all built around having a place to grow the food that your home eats and shares in that community experience. It's a kind of a unique community, has a variety of housing types. Some are for sale, some are rental, and it's a very unique place. But it also is a residential agricultural type of form in the architecture, which we thought kind of felt like some of the community here as well. And then in a little bit lower intensity development type, there are many in the Northwest and some in this area. There are cottage cluster communities with small single-family homes, cottages. with some shared facility, a common room or a common building. It isn't necessarily co-housing, but it has some of those attributes where they have shared open spaces, shared common space, but also small residential community that kind of fits the character. And it's a different way of thinking about how to do single-family homes within the community, which is something that we thought might be interesting to explore. It has some of the same similar characters. This one was in Bainbridge Island, but we've seen them in Portland and throughout the many communities. We're going to look at 3 sites today, the ones in yellow. In future meetings, we'll look at some of the other opportunity sites within the community, and we just want to focus on the 3 sites that we have today. And the way we want to do this is to go through, think about a series of questions here. What are kind of some of the existing characteristics you'd like to see maintained? We'll go through some of the site evaluation, and is that consistent with your thinking? John, you'll chime in on this when we get to those. Is there anything in the zoning and design ordinance that might be preventing any of these concepts? I mean, Bob can weigh in on some of that. And then, are there other concepts you would like to see explored? So are there other strategies and how these diagrams are presented that might be important to also look at in the future? So we're going to go through these sites, and the Humboldt site, what we'll do is I'll go through them on the presentation, and then we'll be able to do a little work session on it, and then we'll jump to the next one. So we'll try to keep some time so we treat each of the sites fairly. The Humboldt Street site is a very unique site because it's visible from Washington. It has an interesting connection from the residential neighborhood to the park, and it also transitions from the kind of commercial Washington Street into a residential neighborhood. And so how that transitions is somewhat unique. We think that the frontage at the corner is important as placemaking. It was discussed originally that Humboldt Street could possibly be the access for the vehicles for parking, and to keep them out of the rest of the residential neighborhood, and the one-way street that proceeds to Washington there, Jefferson, and then we'll place the buildings not up to the street, but in a way that kind of forms spaces and provides a kind of a unique opportunity of transitioning smaller buildings, commercial and residential and mixed use into the neighborhood. So the 2 options, and these are just 2 conceptual ideas, include the one on the left, which has a commercial building at the corner that kind of opens up to a corner plaza. Then there is parking behind it, possibly tucked under the hatched area, shows parking with possibly a portion of the building over the top of the parking, and then a little courtyard along Jefferson that opens up onto Jefferson, and then another small commercial space, possibly more of an office, small business orientation, and then housing along the back portion of the property there. So it kind of encompasses the parking area, and you can wander from the parking to the plaza and to the corner. So it has commercial parking, residential parking, and it transitions back and provides somewhat of a buffer between the commercial activity and the neighborhood. The other one is similar, but has a little bit more of, and we're thinking that could have 2 or 3 units. It could have 2 units in the back, maybe a third unit over the front building. So they could have 3 residential apartments, one maybe a little bit larger than the others. And then on the plan to the right, we're looking at maybe 2 apartments, one over each of the commercial buildings, and then a little bit more commercial square footage with possibly some tuck-under parking under both buildings to add a little bit more parking where there's commercial orientation. So providing a little more commercial opportunity, maybe a couple of apartments, and the same orientation for the corner, holding the building to the corner, not thinking of it as being right up against the street like a Main Street configuration, more like the pattern that you see in town where there's a little bit more space between the street and the sidewalk and the buildings. So we have a couple of questions specific to these diagrams. And one is, do we get the kind of fundamental site plan correct with the parking in the back and the buildings up in the front? Is there a desire to activate the corner of Washington and Humboldt for public use? Should there be more of an open space plaza at the corner there? Are the building footprints and 2 stories appropriate to the site? Are the residential units kind of thinking of them as being on the second floor more than on the first? Is that an appropriate strategy? Or on the one scheme, we have residential units that might be down at the parking level at the first floor as well, where it's in orange versus red. Does it feel like the pedestrian permeability and circulation is a suitable strategy with the kind of 2 buildings with the courtyard in the middle? And as I said previously, is the parking generally located in the right place for this small site? We thought we'd start with the small one first. Start easy and build up.
Okay, so
And
now-
with that, feel free to provide any and all of your comments.
Okay, anybody want to start? You have some thoughts, Stephen?
I do. I always do. In terms of,
Would you like the questions up or the diagram?
I think I would like the questions up
We all
because I
have the
can
diagram.
Okay.
review the drawings here in front of me. I was going to say it seems like my first thought is regarding the public activation. It seems like there are, for the purposes of this conversation, perhaps primary, secondary, and tertiary elements of public integration or public space and the way that the public uses spaces. Primary being the parks, the plaza in front of the community center, those kinds of things. As a building owner and a building developer, I'm not sure I would want to invite a primary space, that kind of activity to happen on my development. I think it's good to have secondary and tertiary perhaps is more private for people that live there. Seems like with Vandeleur Park across the street, that you've got a really good kind of primary public space within proximity of this building. So it doesn't seem like that really needs to be an objective that is baked into the development of this property per se. I think it's hard to avoid making that corner something that addresses the public right of way. I mean, it's so obvious. So I don't think that needs to really necessarily be baked in either, but maybe it does. Maybe we need to say something that encourages that and dissuades someone building a cloister or something. Other questions? I think the footprints are interesting and they make sense to me. I really studied the earlier renderings that were presented to us when we were developing the master plan, and I think I like them better. But I think it'd be interesting to see how a design would be fleshed out with what you've provided. I think residential second floor makes a lot of sense. Pedestrian circulation, I would say that circulation is important, but also, as you said, the sense of place and creating a place where you could, perhaps dine on the sidewalk or dine in that courtyard could be a really nice aspect to that particular site.
Anybody else?
I was trying to remember from our previous discussions about this property, as far as the retail that it would allow. Do you remember that, Sandra? Was it more, we talked small office type and then small retail. And there were some suggestions thrown out about that. Pharmacy was one of them, but.
So there, no, let me look at my notes. It's it's limited food and alcohol service on the property, but it did leave it open if that was part of a soda fountain and a pharmacy. And when the general plan policy was made, it did not try to constrain the property too much. It's not working. There we go. So the idea was that essentially the uses allowed in the RSC zone would be permitted here with some limitation on food and beverage. And a good example of what the RSC zone already prohibits are new full-service restaurants, sit-down restaurants, bars, hotels, things of that nature.
Thank you, thank you. I was asking the question because of how important is the pedestrian circulation, and is it suitable on the properties? And I am tending to like the drawing on the left a little more. I think that's more pleasing to the eye. But I am concerned with having 2 second stories right there to the front of the property on both drawings. And maybe we talked about that before in previous meetings, I'm not sure. But it seems already to start to close things in. So you have a 2-story across the street now. You have some 2-story housing behind, I believe, and now you're starting to close things in more. And that would be one of my concerns, is to start to get too much 2-story, too close to the street, and pretty soon everything starts to feel very condensed.
Okay. Michael?
I do have some questions, but building on what Lynn said, is yeah, I agree. I mean, I know that the was it Bainbridge? It was a denser looking town, so a lot of the spaces that you presented functionally accomplished a lot of what happens here, but things were higher, so you get a little more of that canyony, feel. So I could, having seen that and then seeing that here, I could see that being represented in a way that feels that it's sort of a degree of infill development that is, people might interpret as like, oh, okay, well, this is where Yountville is going. They're trying to make it denser, higher, and it could be, disproportionate, knowing that a lot of the other properties just aren't going to change. So we need to just be mindful of that. Related, the question I had is, is the footprint and amount of parking and just the general allocation of space already based on some amount, some ratio, or I was just curious what determined this initial pass?
Yes, so in the residential scaled zoning district, you can have FAR of 25% for the commercial uses. You get an additional 15% for the residential uses. So on this 10,000 square foot site, that's essentially 2,500 square feet, 1,000 square feet for 2,500 square feet for the commercial and 1,500 for residential. Parking ratios are determined by the code. This district requires a 15-foot front setback, but side and rear setbacks are determined based on, as part of the master development plan process. Open space is on a sliding scale, and a 10,000 square foot lot has about 10% required for open space. So those are all parts of the code that are already spelled out, but there's an opportunity to shape more of the specifics for this parcel.
Yeah,
Based on its location.
Mainly my reaction was sort of the amount of parking for a space that's this small. I mean, if there is flexibility between parking and open space, just given, and I will say a lot of the setup that you shared in terms of sort of the discoverability, I thought was really well said. Not being an urban design specialist, but sometimes things happen by accident, sometimes they happen deliberately, sometimes they start out by accident and you're like, hey, this is great, let's perpetuate it. So it kind of feels there's maybe a little bit of that, and we have an opportunity to shape how things evolve, and we can take the best of what's been working. so, thank you for setting it up that way, because I think it gives us a sort of a common place to start. So, with that in mind, yeah, the question really is how much parking does the space really need? And if we like a lot of that pedestrian exploration, then we should seek to optimize it, I would say, given that will be other places to park, and they may not, the size of the establishment may not necessitate that much. But I know parking is a bigger, separate subject, but we should look at this property in context of the overall town plan on parking, I would imagine. The other thing I was curious about too is that it's really the context of the site. So one of the things about this particular property is that it is the end of sort of the end point of what people mainly see in Yountville, and then it goes to the Vandeleur Park. And the thing that's always separately bothered me is that it just sort of ends, right? Like if you're walking on that side of town, the sidewalk disappears. You kind of have to awkwardly cross over to the west side, and then, which is fine too. So I'm just thinking, with a property here, drawing people further is great, and the park is right there. So the question is, to me, how does the space work with the park in a way that because I don't see a lot of people use the park, because I think they sort of stop sort of before then. So I'm wondering if there's a way to integrate the park somehow into the space that creates more concentration. And so that's why I think the space on the left is more interesting, because it looks like you have this contiguous open space. I'm not actually sure on the right what that gray I'm looking at there. It looks.
Yeah, that I'll answer.
Yeah, okay.
That central part is a kind of a smaller version of the scheme on the left.
Okay.
It's still meant to be an informal kind of internal open space,
Yeah.
semi-private. But what it's showing on the lower part is representing a stair to get up to the south building.
Mm-hmm.
So if you look on the one on the left, that stair is kind of buried within the parking bay.
Yeah.
So in this case, we wanted to maximize more parking. That was kind of the goal on this one. So the stair then would have to shift out. Or you could move it back and just remove one parking space. So that's what that's showing.
Okay. Yeah.
Variation on that.
Well, in that case, I definitely would. I would put anything that's functional like that towards the back, because it.
Yeah.
So it's mainly because I'm not really reacting to the heights, because we're only looking at a floor plan. It was really more about how do we anticipate the flow of foot traffic go into the space and then potentially into the park in a way that doesn't just take advantage of the space, but take advantage of the park itself, I think, in an interesting way.
I think that kind of leads into my comment is, I'll take what you were saying a little farther, is I like the placement of the entry, on you taking advantage of that and capturing people as they're walking. I do see a lot of people walk through Vandeleur Park and then they're a little lost.
Yeah.
But would it make more sense to make the entry point to the property from there, right through there? Because right now you're leading them, well, into the store, but down the side way, and people are going to think that they can go all the way down that road. And
On
this
Jefferson
is
Street.
residential, so we don't want people walking further down there.
Mm-hmm.
If the entry to the property could be on the corner there, and then that just one courtyard type entry to a something.
That's another option to explore.
Yeah.
I think that was what I liked about the earlier rendering that we saw with I think it had an entrance into the rear court on the corner there, if I recall correctly.
I
Maybe?
don't remember.
I don't remember it either.
Yeah,
Okay.
that's what I
Yeah.
thought.
To me, that makes more sense. Instead of drawing people down the side, and then, so I like the idea of the parking in the back. That's a very standard Yountville thing. 2 stories, I would want to see it not 2 stories on the face. It could be 2 stories, but like a lot of the places have like Heston has an apartment in the back, but you'd never know it. You never see it, but it's back. I wouldn't want to see 2 stories on the street for all those reasons. Pedestrian circulation, I think, goes back to having an entry on the corner for me, and, yeah, parking behind. So those are kind of my concerns.
Great.
Can I just make one more comment? I don't know the history of this particular parcel, but when I look at the photograph of that's kind of the underlay of the questions there on the screen, I've always thought that it looked like there was something there that perhaps burned down or somehow went away. And it seems to me that it kind of begs for a 2-story building at that corner. It feels like if it were 1 story at the corner to address massing concerns, that it almost would feel kind of puny compared to what I imagine might have been there before, or the residential properties that kind of back it up. So,
Stephen, are you talking about both buildings? Both should be 2-story?
yeah, well, I mean, I think that's what I liked about the renderings that we saw in the initial concept, and I actually was very concerned about having such a massive structure right across from the park. And then when I walked it, I realized that the park kind of feels like it starts further up Jefferson Street, and that this is really something that's more visible from Washington. And for those reasons, and because it feels like it's part of more of a central district, that it could be afforded a higher height limit at that corner to make it feel more like it was part of the central business district as opposed to the residential district that's right behind it.
And that would basically be the ground floor would be the commercial space, and then an apartment above, and it could have dormers and roof forms that provide a mix of that feel of being
Sure.
partially commercial and partially residential. It just dawned on me I just had a question. We kind of showed these as kind of hardscape plaza on the corner. However, you were talking about this relationship with the park, and another thought would be that you could kind of try to drag the park across the street to this seating area. It's not really a plaza, it's a small space. But is there some thought about this idea of possibly pulling the park across the street so maybe it has a little bit more of a green landscapey feel than, say, a hardscape plaza feel as a sensibility? There's 2 different strategies on it. You have a beautiful green space. You can have a hardscape adjacent to it that you can sit and look at. Or you could be sitting in part of that green space, but it can be extending and dragging the park across.
The park stands on its own very well, and you wouldn't want the commercial property to get lost in a park. You want people to know that it is a commercial property. That's just my thought. Any
Good.
other comments or questions from you guys?
Okay.
You should open it up to the public at this
Sure.
point.
Oh, okay. So are there any members of the public that would like to come up and comment on their thoughts for this piece? Come on.
Well, after that, of course I'm on.
Of course. Just waiting for an invitation.
Hi, Carrie Dorman, Yountville resident, and also a member of the Town Council's ad hoc committee for the Zodo rejuvenation. So I really hadn't planned to say anything tonight, so I don't have my usual copious notes, but I would just urge us to remember this is the first time we're seeing these, including some of the members of the ad hoc committee. This is the first time. And I think we're at a point now in the process, as I think Director Liston tried to explain and did explain, this is broad concepts. These are not projects. Nobody's put in an application to build these buildings. There could be 2 buildings, there could be 1 building, there could be 6 little cottages. And that is going to be true, I think, of everything you all are discussing tonight. So I would just say, from the perspective of, I think it was Commissioner Zagorczyk who said, what is the end game? And I'm certainly not overriding Director Listing. I think I'm just reiterating. The end game tonight is to come away with some concepts and guidelines and thoughts of what we'd like to see, what we being you, what you'd like to see, what you would not like to see. And then that will come back to the ad hoc, go back to you, go back to council. We'll bounce this ball around a few times. But tonight, we are not looking at these drawings and saying, well, let's move this an inch, let's do this. It's just conceptual. And really, conceptual isn't even the right word. It's just ideas. What do you want to see? What don't you want to see? And then staff will take that and make it into, I think, as Bob said, we're going to end up not with drawings, we're going to end up with ordinances. So they have to be something that we can take and then apply when a drawing does come forward. So just sort of a reminder for you guys and the ad hoc and the council and our listeners of where we are in our process. This is my best analogy. This is the tip of our iceberg on this. Thank you.
Carrie, was there something that you heard that was a little too specific or going too deep into?
Yeah. That's a good question.
Well, I mean, from my point of view, and I think I heard this because I do the same thing. I see something on a piece of paper, and I think, oh, well, this might be okay if it's a two-story building, and this might be all right if it's stepped back. I mean, we have to see things on paper. Staff has to bring them to us so that we can, as Director Liston said, get the juices flowing. But when I hear discussions at this point in time of that granular, I'm kind of thinking, I mean, when the property owner comes forward, they may bring a teepee in the middle of the plot, the middle of the tract. So
That's a bad idea.
good to keep an open mind, Director Miller. So,
If it's second story.
I mean, I just say, I think, so when you ask, that's the answer, is I think I'm hearing a lot of focus on this site plan, that site plan, move here, move there, rather than, I'd like to see open vistas. I'd like to see use of this. I'm hearing some of both, but I just didn't want to get off track. Thank you.
Okay, along those lines, I would just say that I would want to see it stick with our guidelines, that, that it would not be massing. It would be, the second floor would be stepped back in a way that didn't make it look massive, and that it wouldn't be up against the created sidewalk area like some of the buildings in town, but have the space beyond the sidewalk, like Priest Ranch or Protea, instead of Bistro Gentil and Hill Family, which are right on the sidewalk, because those are very tight. So those are a little more general comments.
I agree with that, and I do like the concept of having the space in the front, so that I think that draws you to the park. I think if somebody is sitting here or walking out, they're drawn to the park that way, and I like that. And I agree with you when you make that comparison about Summerston and Protea. They're right there, right against when you walk by, you don't see the architecture. You don't see it until you're across the street. And here, I think you could really be able to visualize it.
Okay. We're going to jump to the, more, sorry, I didn't get to see. Yep.
Yep,
Sure.
come on up.
Hello, my name is Rich Woodson. I'm the property owner, and I live at 2008 Humboldt Street, and my wife is here, and as well as our architect, John Caston. I just wanted to say to Van Meter, this totally blew my mind. Awesome. Thank you for putting this together. It's not at all what I had in my head, from those original renderings, which was more of like an L-shaped building just occupying frontage all along, but I totally understand and get it, how this would add to the flow. I really do want to benefit from the natural beauty of our park and how that flows into the property, and just make that a contiguous thing. I do hope that the residences will be on top and that they'll be set back in a way that the occupants can enjoy walking out onto a balcony or a veranda and look down on our vibrant Washington Street and the beautiful mountains and palm trees and look down into the park. That's what I'm imagining for this property. You know, we're still, as you said, in the beginning stages, but it's not really, this is not as conceptual as you might think. We're teed up, we're ready to go. And I've got my architect here. We're actually do need to get granular. We need to get as detailed as possible because we're ready to go. So the sooner we can get specific about what we're looking for and give us the guidance and our architect the guidance that we need, we can move forward.
Anybody else?
Yep.
Come on up.
Okay. Whitney Diver McAvoy, Yountville Chamber of Commerce. Also, like Carrie, I do not have a list prepared for this, so I apologize. I'm usually a little bit more succinct. Kim, I really liked what you said on the output about being as general as possible and allowing as much leeway as possible. One of my concerns in sitting through this first presentation, which these architects did a lovely job, they're beautiful, this is incredibly detailed. And I understand staff needs to start somewhere, but this is really concerning. The questions that are up on the screen that are asking where parking should be located seems incredibly out of context for this point of time in the discussion. And respectfully, with regards to the Humboldt property, we don't want to get as detailed as possible right now. We need to stay up here. When we do that, what's going to happen is people are going to start to think that that's reality, and I think we all know that that's not. One of the questions that I do have for staff and for Kim or whoever can ask it to staff is why are we not looking at current design ordinances that exist, discussing those and how to update them to reflect the changes that we made in the general plan? It feels to me like this process is a little bit out of sync. I feel like that would be a lot easier. I feel like we are very knowledgeable about our current design ordinances. So for us to have this discussion without having those in front of us and looking at, okay, this is what exists now, this is what we need to update, because we've actually gone through this process and looked at renderings for all of the sites that we're going to talk about tonight. And why are we doing that again? That does not make sense. So I wanted to put that out there, see if we can kind of step back a minute and figure that out. Yeah. Thank you.
Thank you. And that was kind of where I was going with my first question. This was kind of a surprise that we're approaching it this way. So I think it's caught us all a little off guard. Anybody else from the public want to comment on this site plan or the thoughts that have been put forward? Okay, we close this, or what?
Should we move to the next one? Okay. So I do want to just emphasize that the reason, the purpose of these diagrams are just that, to elicit response. And some people have said, well, yes, not having the parking up at the street is an important thing. Having the parking in the back is important so that the building is what you see rather than the parking on that important corner.
But aren't those already in our ordinances, that parking goes to the back?
In some instances, yes, and we're reinforcing those and making sure that that isn't something that anybody wants to change. But we're trying to make sure that any of the types of regulatory framework that you have in the future is consistent with what your thought is. So you have, it's kind of initially a second try at having that conversation, and we'll maybe see a little bit of that at some of the other diagrams that we have as well. So the point wasn't to challenge all of them, it was to try to reinforce those and make sure that that is what everybody is thinking and continuing on. So it's the first time we've had the opportunity to have a conversation with you. So that was really the intent of
But
these.
it does, I have the same question as why we're doing it this way instead of looking at the ordinances and deciding how to make them fit the general plan instead of looking at specific
Okay.
properties. To me, I don't understand
Okay.
why we're doing it this way.
Well, that's good feedback,
all.
and we may switch over to another strategy at our upcoming meetings. Okay. So if we proceed to the second site here on the other side of Washington Street, on the west side, we have parking lots up against the street. This is an internal view of the parking lot. It's to the north of V Marketplace. There's 4 rows of parking there, and we are looking at, there's been conversations about developing a portion of that for new buildings, new commercial buildings, possibly new hotel on the site adjacent to the V Marketplace. There is a water line that proceeds along in the middle of the site that's shown dotted there. There's also conversations about how the building should relate to the street. Adjacent right in front of V Marketplace, there's already an existing retail commercial food establishment. Then there's an open space. And so part of this conversation is how should these buildings relate to Washington Street and not create a wall along Washington Street is one of the pieces of the conversation we wanted to have with you. There's also a view corridor so you can see through the parking along the circulation and out towards and over the trees to the freeway and across the highway. And so there's a few view corridors that are important. And then there's also within the open spaces within the site, there is a real formal organization and a series of walks that you can proceed through and into the site. And so there's a thought that this development would connect to some of those open spaces along it in a more processional, formal relationship with those existing very nice appointed spaces. So this diagram, should we take both of these at the same time or one at a time, do you think? Probably one at a time. So what this diagram is trying to articulate and illustrate is a idea that there would be buildings along the street, along Washington Street. They would be a little more informal, small retail buildings, possibly food-oriented, with a series of open spaces kind of between them so that it's kind of building and open space and building and open space and building. And these are smaller buildings, and then, and those are in the red there. And then the blue would be a somewhat larger building. It would have a relationship to those open spaces kind of in between the retail restaurant, commercial uses up along Washington, and that could be a hotel of 2 or possibly 3 stories. Of course, it's now set back away from Washington Street, and then it would have a more formal relationship with the courtyard, paseos, and events area that is kind of organized behind it. So understanding that mass is important, but thinking of this as a site plan organization, it would retain the parking that is in front of the Grodzinger building, and then it would have a drop-off along it in some location, and then so you'd have parking somewhat still along Washington Street, and then but it would be extending this pattern of small buildings in the foreground of Washington Street, and then a somewhat larger building slightly behind it as well. Anything else on that, John?
I think that's all. There was discussion about potential shared parking behind the vintage house.
That's
So
right.
if, for a parking concern, if you were staying at the hotel, it would be most likely a valet situation where you wouldn't park right there, it would be taken in the back somewhere.
So, yeah, so it retains some of the existing parking along Washington, and then the other parking would be more focused, and valet would get additional, more efficiency in the parking by valeting the parking behind in that area. Should we? Yeah, the questions are, so I'm gonna, so if we just focus on this diagram, and then we'll jump backwards to the other side of the V Marketplace. This is the relationship of having the smaller buildings along Washington that are kind of separated, creating open spaces and a pattern that's, so there's a series of individual buildings along Washington and a series of open spaces. Does that seem like a pattern that's feels like the vision for Yountville along Washington Street? That's sort of what we've sort of been seeing along it.
Isn't that, again, already in our parameters? I mean, the property that you showed, Stewart Cellars and Southside Cafe, it was part of our request that it had to be split up into multiple pieces, not just one big building. So isn't that already built in to our
To some
ordinances?
level. The idea is to look at this parcel specific because we have so few developable parcels left. And it's an opportunity really to make sure that the design guidelines work, to drive them to a more beneficial direction where we can. So no, I don't think we want to rely on what's in there, but to discuss opportunities for the site, and to call out if you think courtyards are special, to discuss 1 or 2 story at the street, to really to understand if this arrangement and site layout makes a 3-story appropriate in this location or not, because that wasn't fully defined as part of the general plan. There was a lot of indicators that suggested that if you step back and towards the center of the development,
But then
looking at this specifically is what we're trying to.
But that's already in there, that it stepped, which is what I would say, that any 3-story would be to the back, which is already in there. Those things are already in there, though, so I don't understand why we have to talk about specific floor plans.
I think the current
Or-
criteria.
No, we're not looking at specific floor plans. We're looking at the broader ideas, but we're trying to have a discussion that will lend itself to beneficial design guidelines. And maybe I'll let Bob jump in because I just cut you off.
No, no, I'm just gonna say that, yes, your current, your current design guidelines are good, but they are pretty generic. I mean, they're intended to apply to multiple properties. So what we're doing is we're having the architects sort of do some layouts based upon those generic guidelines and testing them. And we're trying to find out, would it, for example, you could very well have a single building along the entire frontage up near the street. And if it was 1 story and, wasn't 2-story to be stepped back, but if it was a single story, that would be okay. I think the question here is it more appropriate to have a repetition of smaller buildings with, again, this notion of open spaces leading pedestrians through between them? Is that more important than, let's say, a continuous building frontage along Washington? And both would be okay according to your guidelines. It's just looking at individual sites and the way that they've currently developed and what's around them, what makes sense for this property? Should we go a little further in terms of refining the guidelines for individual sites? And if the answer is no, that the general guidelines are fine and that the ZDRB and the town council will grapple with these on a case-by-case basis, that's fine. I think what we're trying to do, and staff has suggested, is if we can provide additional guidance to applicants before they go through the cost of having to bring forth the detailed plans and give them some initial guidance, then we will save the applicants and the city and the town some time and trouble.
I think to build upon that too is some of the courtyards and open spaces that we've recently obtained are Priest Ranch is through that narrow courtyard. It's really at the rear of the building. Handwritten follows that same model where it's even more narrow, that courtyard. And is that truly the types of open spaces that the ZDRB and the council wants to see? Do you want more of a plaza akin to what's shown here?
part of those questions is like this
It, I have two thoughts. One is it would be good to audit our current ordinances and see how they are or are not compatible with the master plan that's been outlined and really looked at with a fairly granular level of detail, and understand what we think we need to be addressing and what we don't need to be addressing. I think for us to look at other sites in North Yountville or at the south end of town and say, would that fit here? I mean, you said it yourself. There's a million different ways or innumerable ways that you could look at this. One of the things that I'm thinking about is conversely to the idea of having a bunch of smaller buildings with courtyards in between, you could look at the V Marketplace and say, this is a massive building without any windows at all. Is it appropriate to say, maybe we should have another massive building that has windows next door to it? Because that's more compatible with what exists there now. And I think it's kind of impossible for us to look at this with specific examples that are put before us and try to build ordinances that are broad enough to encompass this and the other things that we've seen before when the buildings and the developments that come before us and before the town council should address the site that they're on in a more specific way than saying like, do we want big buildings at the back and smaller buildings at the front? I mean, most people would probably say that, but if you came up with a really compelling statement building that looked really good with the marketplace and felt like it gave some presence to that side of Washington Street, I wouldn't want to rule that out.
So I just have one more comment because I think it'll help. Bob, sorry, was it Bob? Bob, yes. Thank you for answering the question that way, because you answered an earlier question that I had, and it sort of started to make more sense to me, which is there are two ways. The ordinances are a set of measurable criteria that you have to adhere to, right? Last time we were here, we talked about design guidelines. They can be very vague. They can be very specific. And we need to find the right balance. So my interpretation of this is reacting to these designs and the commentary, in theory, could get interpreted as design guidelines, right? The idea being that should you come forward with a proposal, we have done some pre-work to write up what would probably have a better chance of making it or not, right? Those are not ordinances. Those are very specific guidelines that, so if you come up and you say, I'm going to build a brutalist concrete structure that meets all the ordinances, we're going to shoot it down, right? And we're saving everyone time by trying to put it into words. What Sandra was saying is that we have fewer developable properties, so anything that does come on board has an opportunity to kind of create the cohesiveness and the town feel that we want to have. So it's an opportunity to weigh in on that. The question I had, so that is my takeaway, and you're nodding, and okay. The question I have though is, would we be so specific with these design guidelines on a per parcel basis? That's where it gets tricky, right? I don't believe that we can. So that's kind of there's going to be an art to it that by saying, okay, you're going to take all these comments from per parcel basis and then somehow generalize them. That's going to be harder. And so that's the part I'm less clear on how that will work.
And you're absolutely right. When we translate this to text, it is going to be more generic because we're not going to be referring to, a diagram. And let me define terms because we're sort of throwing out ordinances and design guidelines. I see them as very different. Ordinances are mandates. They're requirements. The only way you vary from those is by changing the zoning or getting a variance. They're very hard and fast. Design guidelines typically are more suggestive, and there's usually a provision in them that says, these are, sort of our best guidance. But if you have a superior plan that deviates from these, and you can prove to us that really it has benefits for the community, we can go in that direction. So they aren't as hard and fast, and they give you and the applicants some flexibility. But again, they put out generally what it is you think you're looking for. And again, if you know, the applicant has a phenomenally creative approach that no one had ever thought of, and it works, you still have the leeway to approve something like that.
But that's only giving the opinion of this family of the board. What if we get 3 new members and they have very different ideas? So you're trying to get us to pin something down that is just our opinion.
The same holds true with your
But-
general plan. You just went through that effort. It
No, that
is-
it wasn't just us that decided,
Well, no, it's town council
and the town, and they made it very clear what kind of things they were looking for.
Right, but
And
again, it's a
everybody
moment in
knows
time.
what those are.
It is a moment in time, and yes, absolutely, that will change over time, and that's why these documents do need over time to be fluid. You know, just looking at them once every 20 years probably isn't sufficient.
But that's what's gonna happen. So, which is why we wanna be broad.
But, you know, I would also say that that's true, but I think you have to draw the line at some point. I mean, when we agree to the guidelines and submit them, we should do it with that in mind, right? If we were completely self-centered and said, we have this opportunity to shape the future of Yountville forever, and let's burn that fire as long as we can, then we would do it out of ignorance. But, you know, the hope is that our successors would say, wow, they really thought through this, and I appreciate that they did.
And I would even jump in that when the zoning ordinance was last updated, it included some conceptual design ideas for the neighborhood that you live in, and it established the street layout and the building heights for the different properties and the view corridors that were to be maintained, and established a lot of those conditions specific to that property in the zoning ordinance to help guide that when it developed. Similar guidelines were in place for the Catholic Church property. And all of those are stale at this point, so I do think that we want to look at them with a fresh set of eyes and make sure that they're still relevant for whatever development we might see over the next 20 years. And make sure that we have the elements that this community as a whole has really described as important. And Kim, you're so right that a lot of that is incorporated into the general plan, probably more so related to that third story element than anything else, because we were very careful to indicate step back, center of development, no verticality on the street. And so that is really helpful, but that's just a portion of everything we want to achieve. And I would push you to plan for the future, to have this vision that takes us a little bit beyond where we're at. We do like what the codes have done so far. You know, that 15-foot front setback has meant that we don't, in commercial areas, means we're not a St. Helena. And even though it's really shallow, it's just enough for a gathering place that creates these qualities that Rick has noted are so important for Yountville. So I think this is an exciting opportunity. We're looking at change areas now, but we plan on bringing you the French Laundry Garden. We plan on bringing the Catholic Church mixed-use property. What if we have an opportunity to really shape those properties for the right type of development? Because I bet you those will develop over the course of this next zoning ordinance update. I can appreciate how the questions we're asking are hard because we're showing illustrations, and in fact, we had renderings in this packet that we pulled out at the last minute. And the fear is that those drawings will look like those are actual proposals, that that's what we want to build. But I have found, and so has the consultant team, that by looking at illustrations, we can really push our minds to decide, does this work or not? And I want you to know I'd be just as satisfied with you telling me, I hate these designs, throw them in the trash, because that helps us move forward. So anyway, I went off a little there.
No, that's fine, that's good.
I really want you to dream, because this is our chance for that.
But I think people know that, to quote, we use Michael's idea, not to bring us the brutalist building. I mean, they look at what Yountville is, and they can understand what the parameters are. And it makes me very uncomfortable to try and get specific about these. And I'm not, obviously, I'm having a hard time with it.
When I first looked at Title 18, I looked at the layout for your neighborhood. And I thought, wow, this is very prescriptive, more so than I would be, and it was in a diagram form. I thought, wow, I have to see how the neighborhood actually was built. And I went on Google Earth, and lo and behold, it was built according to plan. And then when I toured the city with staff, that's a knockout neighborhood. I mean, it was really planned well with, you know, the pedestrian circulation through it, and the pocket parks, and the view corridors, and that was all based upon Title 18. And again, being pretty prescriptive in Title 18. So those sites are done now, so now we're looking at the next handful of sites.
I feel like we're living like a Myers-Briggs social experiment right now.
Yeah, right.
The ENFP here is like, whatever, you know, we'll figure it out, and maybe ISTJ, where it's like, I need to have that, you know. So it is that kind of, you can approach it top to bottom, bottom to top, but invariably it's going to hit a trigger somewhere along the way. That's my psychological comment.
I think, personally, I felt like I walked in and didn't know what was expected. Like, was there, like, what are we doing here? What are we, like, what's the purpose? And so maybe we've gotten there at 25 after 7 to kind of understanding that now, but it would have been helpful maybe to have a little more input before we came to know, because I spent 4 hours going over all the material from the last meeting. But I do understand you're looking for that. I'm still not completely comfortable with the process of getting there, how we're going to get there. It's still a little bit sort of like nebulous is a great word for it. Yeah. So that's my only, that would be my only takeaway right now.
Okay.
The whole subject matter is all subjectivity. So it's hard to really pinpoint.
And one of the things
Turn
that
the page, though.
one of the things that you really like as a designer is to be able to go to your city documents and get a real sense of what the community is looking for. And sometimes you get that in principles and guidelines, and sometimes you interpret those guidelines. But if they have something that is specific to your property that you're actually looking at, oftentimes that's really beneficial for a designer to get a first initial take. That may not be the one that eventually gets presented to the community, but at least you do have a sense of where the community was at one point in time. And you have conversations with the neighborhoods, you have conversations with planning staff over a period of time, and it's usually beneficial to get more information than less information. And as long as everybody understands that it's not being prescriptive at this point, which is clearly where we weren't going, I think that's important. So I thought we got good feedback on the first site diagram. There are a lot of different ideas and a lot of good principles, and so I was pretty comfortable with the kind of the response and the feedback on the first one. And I know these are challenging, and some of them are complicated sites as well. So
I think all of us are able to visualize. That's how we wanted to be on here and got to be on here. But I lost my train of thought. I don't know. But just talking about where parking's, subterranean parking, 3-story parking, for us to make a decision now that that's what we're going to put a parameter on this property without, and give that direction to the developers and architects without it going through the public comment process, because the public was not aware of really what this meeting was all about. So if we're saying, okay, 3-story parking with 1 underground is fine, and we give that to the developer brings us the project, and then all the public comes and says, you promised us you wouldn't do this.
Well, I think we have to clarify the process, that there are no decisions tonight. It's feedback to help develop guidelines that will come back before you, potentially in illustrative format to better understand them, and then to enable staff to draft the language of those guidelines. So this feedback is advisory to the town council, which is where we'll go next. And any general feedback at all really is useful. I think we're looking less at, yes, I'm happy with a 3-story structure versus I think parking should be minimized. I like the use of courtyards and open spaces, more general like that.
But isn't that already a known fact
No,
from all the public meetings we've had? That people don't want to see parking lots and they do like courtyards and plazas?
yes, but they're not well defined in the current code, which is why we want to
But then
have
let's
this
go to the
discussion now.
code and fix it that way.
So in the interest
Where this is going.
of time,
Yeah, I know, sorry.
I'll provide feedback on this. And what I'm inferring is that it's sort of like a classroom picture, short people in the front, tall people in the back. So, the takeaway is more scaled buildings towards the streetscape, larger, potentially taller, more mass, would be towards the back if, to be correlated with whatever the ordinance specifically is. That would be my reaction to this particular.
One of our town council members that is here would like to make a comment. Is it okay if she comes up and maybe can clarify something for us? She was raising her hand, maybe.
Thank you, Chair Cook. And really, thank all of you all. This is an interesting process to watch, having been typically on y'all's side of it. So it's very interesting. A lot of work has gone into this. A lot of thought has gone into this. A lot of emotion. So I have a proposition. The council formed an ad hoc ZODO committee, Zoning and Design Ordinances, and it's Mayor John Dunbar, and I'm the other member. So what if the ZDRB formed a 2-person committee, and the 4 of us sat with staff and kind of went through some of this and kind of navigated together what are our questions, what are our end games, what is it that you as ZDRB folks want to bring to ZDRB, and then what do the 4 of us from all of these iterations want to bring to the council and to our public. I'm not saying we have to do that, and the council would have to put that in place, but I put that out as an idea to sort of maybe, it's tough. I'm sure that Director Liston can attest to the hours she has spent with the mayor and me, just the 2 of us, on, well, what about this? Well, I see this drawing. Well, I don't know. So I get it. We've sort of been where you are, just not on camera. So I totally get it. And it's just, it's not that it's not a transparent process. It's just that it's a big bite. And sometimes it's easier if you can take smaller bites. And so I'm thinking, I just throw out the committee. I don't know if it's probably not agendized, but it might fall within y'all's purview tonight to at least discuss whether you have any interest in it. So I just put that out there. Thank you.
Thank you. I think that would be a good idea, that we're working together with the town council and not as a separate, here, surprise, this is what we came up with.
That's fine with us. We
I
have-
think it would be helpful.
And we think of this as a working session, not a decision-making session, as we said. And we actually just thought that maybe more of a workshop, informal format would allay the fears that anyone's trying to make a decision on any particular item today.
But it is a formal format because it is on camera and people of the neighborhood are watching and they're seeing drawings. And I know they get panicked over that.
And again, we'll probably be coming back 2 or 3 times on this, so I would absolutely say, if anybody's watching, this is interesting to you, please come.
Yeah.
I agree, they should.
It does feel like a sort of an odd sort of Frankenstein hybrid where it's, we're borrowing elements from formal monthly gatherings to review, but we're doing it in a way that's intended to be entirely informal and non-conclusive. So I think that's probably where the wires are being across. I mean, if it's a brainstorming session, we don't need these at all. I mean, it's because there's nothing really that anyone's being held accountable for at the end of this. So that's probably, you wanted feedback? That's probably a conflict, I would say.
Well, and I think it was very apparent with Mr. Woodson that it was a conflict for him. He's obviously ready to move to the next step. And so hearing everything sort of being brought back down to a broad base, for him, I think he might have walked away a little disconcerted.
I agree.
So whether it's two people or whatnot, I mean, I think it's just, I'm open to,
Can't be more than 2.
I have no strong opinions either way.
Okay.
I think having a committee that could do that would be great.
With the town council members that are on that.
And with staff too.
Yeah, yeah,
included,
yeah, totally. I like that idea.
That's fine with us.
That's good.
How do you want to proceed from here? Do we want to just kind of hold off and wait until the committee's formed and have that meeting and then come back at another date?
Sure, why don't we, well, we don't have all 5 members here tonight, so I would hesitate a little on choosing the 2 since it wasn't agendized before tonight. But it is appropriate to have discussion as to who may be interested. And we are hoping to make a meeting with the council ad hoc committee on Friday of this week, and that's something that we can explore further with them. And our goal in that meeting is really to decide how to involve the decision makers, how to establish a process that's going to lead to the right result. And this is part of that discussion, so.
And how often are you meeting?
We're meeting generally once a month with the ad hoc committee,
Okay.
then once a month at ZDRB and once a month at council.
Okay. Is there anybody here that would like to participate with that?
I would very much like to be on that ad hoc committee.
Lynn?
Well, it depends, because I still work part-time, so it's always can be a conflict.
Is it,
We
are the
generally
meetings
agendize them during the day.
Fridays or
They've been Mondays thus far.
midday or early or late?
Monday at 10 is when we've been meeting.
Monday at 10. Would that work for you?
It could.
Are you interested?
I am interested, but I think you probably have more flexibility than I do, Kim.
I do, but I'd like to see somebody else do it. Michael? Mondays at 10? But this Friday?
Yeah, the daytime hours would be a challenge for me.
Okay.
Because we're adding 2 people, so I think.
Why don't we, because we can't do it anyway. I mean, we can't, it's not a part of the agenda today. So I definitely have an
Okay.
interest in it,
And Stephen?
and so does Stephen,
Okay.
and possibly Michael will as well.
Okay.
Mike will as well. And then we can kind of look at the flexibility of it.
Okay.
Yes?
Might I suggest, before we fold up tonight, that maybe we go quickly to look at the second half of the Site 1, the southern portion, but mostly to talk also about, at least in the presentation, about the wine train site, because that's, at least we'd like you, since you've not seen these, at least then it will give you something to think about for the future, because that's a really unique and challenging site based on its configuration.
I think you're feeling the angst that we have about talking about these specific
Yeah.
pieces.
Okay.
And we can look at the drawings in private and have some ideas, but I would like to leave it for another time.
Do we have any public comment?
Yeah? Okay. They would like to hear from you.
Good evening. Bruce Wright with SB Architects, and I've been studying some of these parcels since 2016. And I think the clarity that I would like to see and that our client would like to see is just defining the general plan and what the intent was. I think the drawings are interesting and they're very theoretical, but I think it's up to the specific developer, owner, client who's going to come and submit plans of something that's of a business proposition that's viable to them on their property. So even though the footprints that you might see might be interesting for theoretical talking purposes to get the juices flowing, if you come up with some rules, I guarantee you, I'm going to come back with something. I'll come back with 4 different ways to solve the issue, and I'm trying to do it in a way that's balanced, that's good for my client, that's really great for the town. And I think we've been good citizens in trying to develop some of those great ideas. And I think some of the concepts that you shared definitely have viability. If you look at the current planning code, I think some of it is a bit outdated, the way that development works these days. Having retail at the base and housing or hotel or something, some sort of mixed use is a much more modern concept. But doing that, like a typical developer is going to want 18 feet for commercial at the base and 12 feet for residential above. And if you add all those up, maybe it's taller than V Marketplace, but maybe that's a scenario that works better for the town, and it builds on these ideas. And I think having smaller buildings in front of larger buildings, all of those concepts make a lot of sense to keep the size and the scale and the pedestrian nature of the town. I think, thankfully we have the prospect of driverless vehicles and things where parking maybe becomes a new paradigm, and you start to think of that in the future. But for us, I think it's more helpful just to have clarity about what the vision is and what you want, and give us those rules, and then we can respond to those in a way I think that will be creative and that support the ethos of what this larger planning document is. So that for us, that's what would be helpful to come out of this side. Drawings are great to get some ideas of what it might mean graphically, but the words that you have written in your code is really what drives our design effort. So thank you for your time.
Thank you. Thank you. Yeah, I would much rather work with the words. But what do you want to do?
Well, I think we're good to wrap up now.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
That's fine.
Okay.
We'll work
Thank
on
you
bringing
for
that back.
Yeah.
all of your work on this.
Yeah, I know. It took a lot to get here. And I don't know where we're going, but we'll figure it out. We'll figure it out.
That's fine. We tried an experiment with something that we have done before and been more successful at, but that's quite all right. And it's really what serves you best is really the critical path to follow. So if there's another path to take, that one works better for you, that's the way to go.
Okay.
We have no problem.
My takeaway is, I think Mr. Wright said it well, that the words are what matters. And I think what I also heard was, let us know what the current guidelines look like. Let's take a look at the guidelines from the general plan. Then we'll see what's missing, what could be refined, and maybe use drawings to, help as examples of those words and how they may lay out. But let's focus more on the text.
Yes.
I agree.
Yes.
Is it possible to get a digital version of the text that is editable, where we could make notes in it and track changes and track notes with each other for the purpose of?
About the zoning code?
Yeah.
Yeah, oh yeah, we
Yeah,
have that.
absolutely.
We have it
And-
in a Word document.
I
We're
think
creating
also-
a red line document that shows those changes moving forward. And that was feedback that we got from Councilmember Moeller at the first joint meeting. And so that's something we're working on to bring forward when we get into the change of language.
And would that give us the option of creating comments within that document, like you do in a editable document?
Yeah.
Because that might be an interesting thing to do, is say, like, I might read it and say, I think this needs to be re-examined and talked about amongst either the ad hoc group or the Zoning and Design Review Board for further clarification or something like that.
My work tomorrow is to start extracting the current guidelines, which are mostly by zoning districts. So for each site, which ones are applicable. And I'm going to start on that tomorrow.
Yeah.
Title 18 and Title 17 is very difficult to get through because you can't, I would like to print the whole thing.
Right.
and just be able to go to it, but you have to pick and choose what you're going to. So I don't know if that's possible to get a,
It's online right now, like if you're accessing it online.
I am accessing
Yeah.
it online, but you still have to,
We have it in a Word
yeah,
document.
yeah,
We
it's
have it in a Word document right now.
great.
So you can edit it and you
Those
can
would be
make
helpful to
comments
have.
on it.
So you can get those through the town website right now, or just?
No, we
Oh,
have.
you
it.
have it.
It's-
Okay.
Yes,
think
but
we're
we
gonna
can share
create
that with
maybe
you.
a Dropbox location.
That would be
so
great.
Everybody can access
Yep.
these.
That would be
We'll
great.
get that to
Make
you.
a note again.
Okay, so.
Great, thank you.
Thank you very much.
Close
Appreciate it.
this part.
Do we have to formally adjourn this?
We still have one more thing on our agenda. Oh, we're adjourning this part, yeah, I think we're good.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Okay, we just have one more thing on our agenda, and that would be the election of a chair and a vice chair. And that is for a year, is that correct? Okay. I have learned a lot, and I don't always feel up to the task, especially as we're reaching this phase. And I would like to hand it off to somebody else. I think it would be good for just a different viewpoint. I think we have some super talented people. So I would like to nominate Michael, if that's appropriate, Zagorczyk, for a chair position. Would somebody else like to put their hand up or volunteer to want to do it? Okay.
I would second your nomination.
I would second the nomination.
First, he has to accept the nomination. Especially after tonight's meeting.
Well, I mean, having been on this for a year now, and this is your 5th, 6th, 8th.
No, not that. It just feels like it.
Yeah, especially tonight.
And, what I've understood is that there are formal parts of this process than informal, and the informal parts are often more important than the formal ones because we're trying to solve problems together. So my default nomination would be that you would stay because it provides a stability and a consistency and continuity that I think we're all pulling from. But I also understand the benefit of sharing and giving people different perspectives. I think, in the short time we've worked together, there is a dialogue here. I feel like we've known each other longer than we've actually have. So I see this more as a potential baton pass amongst us than necessarily a sort of a category shift in terms of how these things are going to be run. So if we do this annually, where every year we say, okay, who's next, then that means, assuming we're all still around, we'll all just get to do it and somebody's got to go first. So if that's the case and we're all signing up for that, then I'd be happy to take my turn, knowing that we'll learn more in the next year so that the next person steps up and we'll be better off for it. So if that works for you guys, then it works for me.
Thank you. I should have put a little more thought and courtesy into that. I think your ability to look at the broad picture and get people onto the same page is fantastic and what we need right now. So
And to identify strategies of getting there, I think he's really
Yes.
adept at that.
yes.
Yeah.
And if that's the biggest contribution I can make and what we need now, then I'll happily do it. But I know that we would all get there together regardless of the formal part of this process. So I don't see that changing beyond simply a loose prioritization effort that I'm sure will continue far beyond this next year.
I promise to still be neurotic about the minutia.
Love that about you.
Yeah, there's a degree of neurosis that's required for this committee, I believe. So we all have
Did I
it.
hear a second?
Yes.
All in favor?
Aye.
Aye.
Thank you. And vice chair?
I would like to see Stephen be vice chair.
You'd like to see me? Oh, thank you.
I second that.
All in favor?
Aye.
Excellent.
Okay.
Excellent.
Congratulations, guys.
I love it.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Guard.
Yes.
Fun times
and
ahead.
On that, we can adjourn the meeting.
I move to adjourn the meeting.
I second
agree.
it.
Aye.
Third and fourth?
Yes.